November 1944. Lorraine, France. The bells had not rung in 4 years. Inside the stone tower of Saint-Edmond's church, a German sniper had been killing American soldiers for 11 days. He worked from the belfry window, 60 feet above the village square, behind a gap in the ancient stone, no wider than a man's fist. He had killed 9 men. He had wounded 6 more. Every time the Americans moved to flank him, he disappeared into the walls of the church like smoke into stone. He was not a soldier hiding in a tower. He was a problem that had no clean answer. Because the moment the Americans leveled a gun at that tower, they leveled it at the oldest building in the village. And the village was still full of people. Corporal James Whitaker was 22 years old. He came from a small town outside Louisville, Kentucky, where his father ran a hardware store and his mother taught Sunday school in a Baptist church, not unlike the one now killing his friends. He had enlisted at 19, crossed into France with the Third Army, and spent 4 months moving east through shattered towns and cratered roads. Steady, quiet, precise, the kind of soldier who checked his rifle every morning the way a carpenter checks his tools, not from fear, but from habit. In 11 days, he had watched 9 men he knew fall in the square below the church. The last was Private Danny Reyes, 20 years old from Albuquerque, hit in the throat while carrying water from the well. Reyes had lived for 3 hours. Whitaker had been there for all of it. On the morning of the 12th day, he sat behind a stone wall with his helmet off and his rifle across his knees, and a look on his face that his sergeant had seen before and had learned to recognize as the edge of something that could not be walked back. His sergeant's name was Frank Osei. Osei was 31 years old, born in Accra, raised in London, naturalized as an American citizen in 1940, and the most competent non-commissioned officer in his company, according to 3 consecutive after-action reports. He had watched Whitaker all morning and decided the situation required a decision from someone with more authority than either of them possessed. Oberfeldwebel Werner Hess was 34 years old. Trained at the Wehrmacht's marksmanship school at Zossen in 1941, deployed first in the Soviet Union and then in Italy before being transferred west as the Allied advance accelerated. 41 confirmed kills over 3 years of war. He was efficient, patient, and entirely without sentimentality about his work. He had chosen the church tower in Montchamp-sur-Moselle not for its spiritual significance, but for its geometry. 60 feet of elevation, stone walls 3 feet thick, a belfry window offering a clean line of fire across the entire square, while presenting almost no visible target from below. He had cleared the bell ropes and stacked the sandbags himself. He had a week's worth of rations and enough ammunition to continue indefinitely. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has studied terrain for 3 years, that the Americans were unlikely to shell a Catholic church in a French village still full of civilians. He believed this made him untouchable. He had not yet been introduced to George S. Patton. By November 1944, the Third Army's advance across Lorraine had stalled along a front where supply shortages and ferocious German defensive action had turned every village into a siege. The Wehrmacht had learned to use the landscape of rural France with merciless ingenuity. Medieval church towers, farm cellars turned into bunkers, stone walls 3 feet thick. American commanders were caught between 2 impossible orders: maintain the pace of the advance, and do not destroy French civilian infrastructure. These 2 orders regularly contradicted each other, and when they did, the men in the field paid the price. 11 days in Montchamp-sur-Moselle had produced 9 dead and a company that had stopped moving. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Graves had already requested artillery on the tower and been denied twice. He had tried flanking movements and lost 2 more men. He had tried night operations and found that Hess slept in rotation, always alert when the Americans moved. On the morning of the 12th day, Graves sent a report to Division that ended with a single sentence: "I need a decision from above, or I need to be relieved." The report reached Patton within the hour. He read it standing up, which was how he read everything that mattered. He asked one question: "How many civilians are in that church?" His aide checked. The answer came back within minutes. None in the church itself, but the village population of approximately 340 people had not been evacuated. Patton stood at his map table and looked at the position marker for Montchamp-sur-Moselle for a long moment. Then he said, "Get the jeep." His aide asked if he wanted an escort. Patton said no. Before we go any further, before we get to what Patton did when he stood in that square and looked up at the belfry window, and what he said to Lieutenant Colonel Graves that no one in that courtyard ever forgot, make sure you subscribe. This channel tells the stories that get a footnote in the history books and deserve a chapter. We tell you what it actually felt like to stand in that square on the 12th day. Subscribe now, and then we'll go back to Lorraine. Patton's jeep arrived at 9:30. He came in fast, no announcement, no ceremony, and the first thing he did was walk directly into the square. His aide grabbed his arm. Patton removed the hand without looking at him and kept walking. He stood in the open cobblestone square in front of St. Edmond's and looked up at the belfry window for 30 seconds. Nothing happened. Then he walked back behind the wall and crouched beside Whitaker and Osei. He looked at Whitaker first. "How many?" "9, sir." Patton nodded. He looked at the church. "Tell me about the tower." What followed was not a briefing. It was a conversation. Patton asked questions, and Osei answered them, and Patton listened the way he listened to terrain reports, with his whole attention, checking each detail against his own read. How thick are the walls at the base? What is the angle from the south approach? Has anyone been inside the church below the tower? Osei answered everything. Then Patton asked if anyone had tried talking to the man. A brief silence. "Sir, he doesn't answer." Patton said, "I didn't ask if he answered. I asked if anyone tried." This is the moment that defined what came next, because Patton's solution to the church tower wasn't artillery. It was not a flanking assault. It was not the thing every man behind that wall assumed a general of his temperament would reach for. It was a door. Patton stood up and walked across the open square a second time, alone, all the way to the church door, and pushed it open and went inside. His aide was halfway across the square before Osei stopped him. Quietly, with absolute certainty. He knows what he's doing. Leave him. The aide stopped. The square went completely silent except for the sound of Patton's boots on the stone floor inside, audible through the open door. Inside St. Edmund's, the nave was cool and dark. The pews had been pushed aside. The altar at the far end was intact. Patton walked slowly up the center aisle, looked up at the ceiling, looked at the stone staircase in the corner leading to the tower. He stopped at the base. He did not draw his revolver. He called upward in German. Adequate, accented, direct. "Soldier. I am General Patton of the 3rd United States Army. I am alone and unarmed in this nave. I want to talk to you about your options. Come down or tell me why you won't." Nothing happened for a full minute. Then, from somewhere above, a voice said in German, "You are lying about being unarmed." Patton looked down at his revolvers. He unbuckled the belt and set it on the nearest pew. He said, "Not anymore." The voice said nothing. Patton said, "You have killed 9 of my men. I have 340 French civilians in this village. If I use artillery on this tower, I solve my problem, and I destroy theirs. I am not willing to do that, but I am also not willing to lose another man to this position. So we are going to find a third option right now, you and I, in this church, and the only question is whether you come down those stairs and we discuss it like soldiers, or whether I go back outside and I find an answer that neither of us is going to like." Another silence. then footsteps on the stone stairs. Oberfeldwebel Werner Hess appeared at the base of the staircase with his hands visible and his rifle slung barrel down across his back. He looked at Patton. He looked at the revolvers on the pew. He said, in careful English, "You actually left your weapons." Patton said, "I told you I would." Hess said, "My commanders told me Americans do not honor their word." Patton said, "Your commanders told you a lot of things. How many of them were here last week?" Hess surrendered. He laid his rifle on the pew beside Patton's revolvers. He walked out of the church ahead of Patton into the square, where 30 American soldiers stood in complete silence, watching the belfry sniper emerge from the door with his hands at his sides, and George Patton 2 steps behind him. Corporal Whitaker stood up from behind the wall. He did not say anything. He watched Hess walk past him, and he did not look away. Patton walked out of the church, took his belt from Osei, buckled it on, turned to Lieutenant Colonel Graves and said, "Get your company moving." Then he got back in his jeep. Werner Hess was processed through the prisoner of war system and held in a camp in England until the end of the war. He was not charged with violations of the laws of war. His position in the tower, however brutal, had been a legitimate military use of a building that contained no civilians. He was released in 1946 and returned to Erfurt, where he worked for 30 years as a watchmaker. A journalist who located him in 1979 found a man of deliberate stillness who chose his words with the same economy he had once chosen his shots. He said the American general had done something he had not encountered in 4 years of war, had come through a door without a weapon, and spoken to him as though the conversation might actually change something. Hess said, "I had been waiting 11 days to die. He offered me a different ending." Corporal James Whitaker returned to Louisville in 1945, went to work in his father's hardware store, and eventually took it over and ran it for 40 years. He attended Mass every Christmas Eve at a Catholic church 3 blocks from his house, and never spoke about St. Edmund's to his family. His daughter found, after his death in 1997, a single index card in his wallet, worn soft from decades of handling. On it, in his handwriting, were 9 names. Danny Reyes was the last one. Patton wrote about the church in a letter to Beatrice 3 days later. "I walked into a church today without my guns and talked a German sniper down from a tower. My aide thought I had lost my mind. I believe it was the first time in this entire war that I have used the one weapon I never talk about. It is not mercy, exactly. It is the understanding that a man who believes he is already dead will take any door you offer him, if you are honest enough to open it yourself first." Some historians argue that what Patton did in St. Edmond's was reckless beyond rational military justification, that a theater commander had no business walking alone and unarmed into a building occupied by a trained sniper, and that the outcome was luck rather than judgment. Had Hess fired, the consequences for the Allied command would have been incalculable. Others argue the opposite, that what Patton demonstrated was the rarest form of military intelligence, the ability to read a human situation with the same precision he read a battlefield, and to understand that the weapon the moment required was not the one on his belt. He did not walk into that church despite being a general. He walked in because of it. Only a man with the authority to level the building could make the offer of not leveling it mean anything. What is certain is that the square in Montchamp-sur-Moselle was clear by noon on the 12th day, and the company moved east before dark, and St. Edmond's church still stands. If you had been in Patton's position that morning, if you had read that report and driven to that village and stood in that square looking up at the belfry, would you have walked through that door alone? Or would you have found another way, a safer way, a way that did not ask a general to bet his life on the honesty of a man who had spent 11 days killing your soldiers? Tell us in the comments, And if you want more stories about the general who won the war and paid for it with everything he had, stories that don't give you easy answers, subscribe. We'll be here.